All right, the button tells me that our Hangout is live, so I will take that as a truth. I am Gaby Goldstein. I am Director of Research at the Sister District Action Network, which is hosting this Fireside chat today. And I'm also Political Director at our affiliated organization, the Sister District Project. Sister District is a national grassroots organization that focuses on state politics, and particularly the power of states as pipelines for progressive leadership and policy, and as venues, very powerful venues for the sorts of policies that affect everyday life for Americans. And so our quarterly book club highlights topics that are aligned with Sister District's mission, including gerrymandering, voting rights, voting suppression, and money in politics. And our current book club selection was Dark Money by Jane Mayer. And I'm delighted to be here today for a discussion about those issues, dark money in politics, particularly at the state legislative level. I'm here with Kimberly Reed, who is the director of the 2018 Sundance official selection documentary, Dark Money. So Kim, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. So Dark Money is opening this Friday in New York, Friday the 13th, and will then be rolling out a wider release all across the country starting next week. So I'm very excited to see the film and to chat with you about all the things that you've learned about dark money and particularly at the state level through that work. So I thought we might just start off hearing a little bit about what drew you to these really important, very topical issues around money in politics and particularly untraceable dark money that we know is everywhere in politics, and how that got on your radar and how the genesis of making this documentary.
Right, right. The first thing I should probably say, since you guys are studying the book Dark Money by Jane Mayer, which has a subtitle that I'm not remembering. I think it was the history of the right. Her book is brilliant and wonderful. It is not related to our film. So those are two separate things. I think it's important so people don't think they're totally interchangeable. What I love about Jane Mayer's book is that I think it does just a brilliant job of laying out the philosophy and the history of these right-wing movements that decided to weaponize dark money as a way to just use it as a political tool that would be really effective in furthering the aims that they find themselves really committed to. I think that our film Dark Money is in a lot of ways just the practical application of all of that history, all of that philosophy. It's a kind of a decoder ring that shows how that history and philosophy is implemented on the ground. And the way that I got at that story, which is a pretty, abstract story to begin with, and it's a story about people who are intentionally obfuscating things, who are intentionally hiding their influence. The way I got at that, that story that has the potential to be a little bit too abstract, was to find real human beings to wrap that story around. I'm from Montana. It's where I grew up, and I feel like I know it really well. I saw let me back up one step and just say that in 2010, when the Citizens United decision was released by the Supreme Court of the United States, and I think we all know what that was all about, right? I was perplexed. I didn't understand how we could have gotten to a point where Supreme Court jurisprudence got us to the point where in the shorthand way that everybody refers to it is that money is speech and corporations are people. How did we end up with any legal body thinking it would be a good idea to unleash unlimited spending in political campaigns. And it was that question, that perplexing, that like, how did we arrive here? That I think was the first kind of question that the film began with, the first spark of, what are we going to do with this? I didn't conceive of it as a film at the time. But in 2012, a couple years after Citizens United came out, I was paying attention to the news back home, and I realized that actually it was late in 2011. I realized that Montana had a case that was actually challenging Citizens United. Montana actually had a law on its books that it passed by ballot initiative in 1912. It was called the Corrupt Practices Act of 1912. And that was basically passed because, long story, I can go into it if you want, but suffice it to say that there was rampant corruption amongst industrialists who came to Montana to try to pull lots of money out of the hills because they were copper miners primarily. So with the battles of these three main copper kings, they pretty much ended up owning all of the newspapers, owning all of the mines, all of the shops that you shop at when you work at the mine, owning the company town and running the company town. And they even owned the politicians. And people say that all the time, and people say, yeah, they're a bunch of crooks and they're bribing them. We're talking about magnates, these copper kings, taking out ads in their own paper, offering to pay legislators $10,000 to vote for them to be a U.S. senator. I mean, we're talking about just the most rampant corruption that you can imagine. In reaction to that corruption, Montana citizens passed a ballot initiative, the Corrupt Practices Act of 1912, that outlawed corporate spending in political campaigns. And that stood for 100 years until Citizens United came around. And in 2012, Montana had a case that was challenging Citizens United. And that was the point where I said, this is a really good way to talk about money and politics without, getting caught in a bunch of bar graphs and a bunch of, discussions that aren't about people in their everyday lives. It's just about a bunch of numbers, what people's eyes are going to glaze over. I really wanted to find the drama in that story. So I started following that court case. It was actually summarily reversed by the U.S. Supreme Court. But in the process of studying that and seeing where Montana was at, I saw that Montana was the real battleground where all of these court fights were happening, that the same lawyers who were behind Citizens United were opening shop. Literally, they were opening, like if they had one satellite office, it would be because they were challenging all of Montana's relatively strong campaign finance laws. And it just looked like it was going to be a flashpoint. I grew up there. I knew this history of copper kings and, copper magnates that are trying to run the whole state. And it seemed to me that citizens would probably rise up and oppose this. And that's exactly what happened. So I ended up following that story. Actually, over the course of 6 years, ultimately, is how long it took to make the film. And that meant that we followed these different dark money groups over 3 election cycles, which is kind of the best way to follow them because a lot of times they sort of pop up with an anodyne or patriotic name and then wreak havoc and then disappear and pop up again with a different name in a different election, kind of putting forward the idea that they're going to care about one issue, but then what they're really after is a different issue, and then they disappear again. They dry up and blow away. So following the vicissitudes of these dark money groups over these 3 election cycles brought us into some really interesting mystery novel kind of whodunit questions that are followed by an investigative reporter His name is John Adams. A little bit on the nose, but
great name.
Wouldn't get away with it if I made that up myself. And it ended up being, just we were on the ride, and I had to keep following that story. So that's how I got involved in it. In 2013, I started to, when we were just kind of cranking up the film, it was the early stages of it. Folks were using the term dark money. I heard that again and again. It may have been invented there. It's kind of hard. I'm not exactly sure where that term was invented, but I know it was being used there. And so I started, seeking funding and kind of shopping the project around. And it has been, a long life cycle since then. But here we are premiering at Sundance 2018.
It's fantastic. And it's really interesting. Actually, you might want to mute me I don't know. There's a little bit of an echo, but now it's okay.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem. So no, that's fascinating, and it's really interesting because in preparing for this conversation, I took a little bit of a historical look at Montana just to understand, have a little bit of context about campaign finance laws there, and it seems like just what you said, that Montana actually has historically been known for having pretty clean campaign laws, kind of dating back to the mine stripping corporate sort of robber baron era approach that had really angered the citizens of Montana, and it seems as though it wasn't really until Citizens United that clean campaign law infrastructure in Montana really broke loose, and there was really this opportunity for dark money in a way that hadn't been historically as present in Montana. And so I think that's fascinating for a number of reasons. One is that we're really focused on the idea here of states being powerful venues for policy making, both at the state legislative level as well as the citizen ballot initiative level, particularly for things like districting, fair districting, and campaign finance. And so it's an interesting historical example of Montana dating back 100 years, using the citizen initiative process to pass a pretty advanced campaign finance law at that period of time. So I think that's fascinating. And so it sounds like Citizens United really obviously changed things. Just, I think folks watching probably know the bottom line of it, but really, from my perspective, it's the shorthand is sort of, the Supreme Court held that as long as corporations give their money to outside groups as opposed to candidates directly, that they could spend an unlimited amount to promote a chosen candidate. Again, as long as the money went to an outside organization as opposed to the campaign directly. And then there was a follow-on case, Speech Now, which essentially established the same rule for individuals, in terms of individuals being able to give freely without restriction to outside groups, but not working to elect a candidate, but not to the candidate directly. And so I'm curious how this played out in Montana. And I think it's exactly right to think of Montana as a microcosm. Obviously, Jane Mayer's work is really, I think in many ways, it takes a very expansive view of this issue and looks historically over 100 years and all over the country. But what you've done is really, just as you said, what happens in a specific case, in a specific state, at a specific period of time? How can we understand how all these issues come together for a specific set of people? And so I'm curious to hear about what happened there. I know that there was and then a later set of reforms in 2015. I'm curious who Art Wittich is and how what his story is here. But what happened in 2010 in Montana, particularly at the state ledge level? My sense is that when this dark money started flowing into Montana, it was targeted at the state legislative level, at least in part. And that, of course, is part of, I don't know, but certainly a trend at that time part of the conservative project with Red Map was an orchestrated effort to take over state legislatures across the country. I'm not sure, maybe it was just a temporal coincidence that this happened in 2010. But I'm curious, was what happened in Montana part of Red Map, or was this sort of a side strategy that evolved more locally? But would love to hear about what happened in 2010 and what you learned about all those sorts of things.
Yeah, as far as I know, it's not related to Red Map, but there's another organization, a national organization that's very well funded, that was behind everything that was going on, and I think ultimately turns out to be responsible for it. The way that it works, I mean, Citizens United did not create 501c4 dark money groups that were used for nefarious purposes to operate in political campaigns. But Citizens United really enabled the use of all of that. In other words, like, people were kind of messing around with C4s and having them kind of cloak political contributions and having those operate in elections before Citizens United. And that's actually what we saw in Montana a little bit, but it was like a pilot program in 2008. And the way we saw it work is almost in its purest form. It's like there's pretty strict contribution limits at the time coming from organizations, corporations, including nonprofit corporations like 501c4s, right? Those contributions that are, oh, sorry, I forgot to mute you. Those contributions that are coming from 501c4s were being used in a way at such a limited level that the purpose of those contributions had to be only so that they could hide who was doing this stuff. It was very clear that the reason people were using a C4 group instead of probably at the time what would have been a 527, just regular PAC, the reason that they were doing it had to be because they wanted to remain anonymous. There's actually some internal politics that have to do with why some of these people were attacked, and it's basically because a group of Republicans in the Montana State Senate worked with a Democratic governor to pass a budget that put them on somebody's hit list because they weren't towing the party line of like resisting and kind of breaking down government and not giving the governor a budget so they could throw the whole state into chaos. And so some of the people who were very conservative Republicans, they just thought it was their responsibility. It's actually their only responsibility. The only one bill they have to pass is the budget, and that wasn't getting passed. So they worked with the governor to pass that budget. They ended up on a hit list, and in the next election cycle in 2008, they found themselves attacked by these nonprofit groups, and they had no idea where it was coming from, who was behind it, what issues they even said they were interested in, which appeared to be completely different issues than they were actually engaging in. And it was just a big, mystery show, the way that is articulated in the film. And I think maybe in one of the clips that you all have seen, because I know there's some clips floating around there, there's a guy named John Ward. He's a very conservative Catholic Republican representative in the Montana House. And it was actually a cloture vote. You guys are civics geeks, so you know what I mean when I talk about a cloture vote. But it was a debate about the death penalty. He's a religious Catholic who believes in life, and he wanted to have a debate about whether or not the death penalty was constitutional. He voted to send that to the floor to have that debate, and that put him on a hit list to be attacked 2 or 3 days before the primary election with postcards that were sent out basically asserting that he was exactly like John Wayne Gacy, this serial murderer who killed a bunch of young boys, right? So this guy who voted the death penalty all of a sudden is being equated with serial murderers. That's the sort of attacks that were happening, and you know, it's it just goes to show that one of the byproducts, it's kind of the wrong word for it, but that you get with dark money groups is the fact that it always seems to end up being associated with negative attack ads. These are not the ads, the shiny, happy candidate ads that people are proud to put their name on, you know, that has them with the candidate with their arm around their family and you know, engaging in positive messages. They're usually attack ads that people are really embarrassed of, that the candidate would probably be if they were seen to have been related to these ads. So they end up as negative. So we saw in 2008, to get back to your question, this pilot program with contribution limits, but you could tell that they were just trying to hide who was launching these attacks. In 2010, we saw that one pilot program from 2008 developed just in the wake of Citizens United, right? Like a couple months after Citizens United, we saw an entire program launched during the primary elections in 2010, where a different dark money group than the one before. In retrospect, we find out that some of the players are the same. That this one 501c4 nonprofit group called American Tradition Partnership was not just, you know, sending out some postcards that were promoting one candidate or attacking another. They were basically running an entire campaign. I mean, the candidate could just go home and put your feet up for the next 4 months until the general election and just like not do a thing and have an entire campaign run for you. And that goes to creating postcards and mailing postcards and creating a bunch of letters that are coming from the candidate and sending out those letters and creating a website and all the language on the website, all of the signage, printing all this stuff, all of the data, all of the data intelligence walk lists, not just lists that come from voter rolls of doors to knock on, but data saying when you knock on this door, this person cares about the Second Amendment. When you knock on that door, their big issue is life. So make sure you talk to them about abortion. Over there, the only thing I care about is taxes. So that's the only thing you should, like really expensive targeted voter data that was being provided to these candidates and run by members of this 501c4 organization. As you talked about, the one thing you can't do with an outside group, with a third-party group, is coordinate with the candidate. And not only were they coordinating one son, one letter, or one son, one website, they were just running the whole campaign for him. And that was something that they actually called the works. Like, does this candidate want the works? Yeah, give them the works. So yeah, that kind of really digging into the nuts and bolts about how these elections were run for candidates is where our film ultimately ends up. is an exploration of a trial where an elected official, who you mentioned, his name is Art Whittick, where he goes to trial to find out if he is, coordinated with these groups, whether he's received, what would amount to being pro bono, in-kind contributions to this candidate because of all these services that were provided and not reported. And it just becomes this big mystery novel about who done it. It's important to know that we were lucky enough in the case, and this is really why I could tell the story of how these dark money groups function on the ground, is we were lucky enough to have some really wild disclosures, some accidental disclosures that come from stolen cars and end up in places you wouldn't believe, and or get passed around to important elected officials who actually know what they are and end up doing stuff with them that leads to further investigations, which leads to more stuff that they discover. And we actually had all of the dots that we could connect to show how this whole campaign program runs, which is of course, again, under any understanding of the way that a 501c4 organization works is illegal. So that's a little bit of the history. I mean, to really sum up, pilot program in 2008 that turns into a full-blown program to run campaigns for a suite of candidates in 2010.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And it's interesting because at the beginning of the talk, you started off by saying that, one of the things that propelled you to ask these questions was really this idea of how did we get here? How did we get to Citizens United? How did we get to a point where a Supreme Court could make this decision? And I think that one of the things that sounds so wonderful about this the documentary is that it really tells sort of drills into an example of much broader trend. And I think that one of the things that Jane Mayer's book does is look at this question from a different angle. How did we get to Citizens United? By taking a historical view and arguing, I think, really persuasively that it didn't come from nowhere. It took 100 years to get to Citizens United and many billions of dollars of concerted effort through multi-pronged strategies, including strategic litigation that built towards a Supreme Court case. And the DeVos family was quite involved in financing a lot of that litigation throughout many decades. And part of and more generally, the entire infrastructure around conservative dark money, following a very long sort of historical trajectory. And so you're able to sort of come in and look at how it all plays out in a particular place over a particular set of elections. It's incredible that you had 3 election cycles to look at. And another thing that I think is really interesting is the idea that what you saw might not have really been connected to RedMap, which was a part of a much bigger conservative project to take over state legislatures. And it may or may not have been. I have no idea. I mean, I took a look at the composition of the Montana state legislature in over the years, and it's very interesting. So in 2009, the House was 50-50, 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans. The Senate was 27 Republicans, 23 Democrats, but the House was split 50-50. In 2011, the House flips to 68 Republicans and 32 Democrats, which coincides with the RedMap strategy, which was really to take over state legislatures, at a very particular period of time. But it might have been a coincidence, or it might have been part of this various threads coming together in unexpected ways in Montana. But I think that it's it's fascinating to see how Citizens United and how potentially these broader strategies did come together in this way. I think that the story you seem to be telling, though, and I can't wait to see it, ends on sort of a positive note, in the sense that there did come out of this set of episodes a new campaign finance law in 2015 around disclosures, and which was able to be passed by a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor, able to put that together, which, as I understand, was upheld by a federal appellate court just this year. So it is the law of the land, and it will stand, which is really a positive story about what states can do to curtail the incursion of dark money in their particular state. So I'd love to just, I know we have to stop in a moment, but to end on this positive idea of states as laboratories for policies that can serve as beacons or models for other states and eventually for federal policy. That's how we get so much federal policy. It comes from the states. And so it sounds like Montana may be a positive case here for how to get through the dark money and sort of go towards the light, so to speak. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, what you guys are doing with your state by state, your state and local strategy, I think is spot on. I think it's how campaign finance reform is going to move, like other issues. Marriage equality is one that comes to mind, where you could just watch, a resolution from a city council in Minnesota be followed by another resolution in some other city on the other side. You can see the number of those resolutions from city councils build and build and build, and school board resolutions, and mayoral proclamations, and then you see it operate at the state level, and you see it kind of catch fire and then move up. I think a lot of us were surprised at how quickly, once that tipping point was hit, that marriage equality just tipped all of a sudden, and there we go. I think that it's going to move the same way with campaign finance, because if you look at the number of American people who feel that there's something terribly wrong with our campaign finance system and needs to be reformed, that far exceeds the number of people who agreed with marriage equality before that was passed. So yes, I think it is a really hopeful story. It is what happened in Montana in 2015 when they passed what was called the Disclose Act, and that is being several other states. I've had a Google alert set for the phrase dark money since like 2013, I think. And it used to just, Montana was really leading the way and was a battleground, so that would pop a lot. You would see it in Maine. There was a lot of talk about it. You can just see the culture, the voting culture sort of develop and evolve when more people talk about this idea and start focusing on it, start holding their elected officials accountable for it, and making sure that they understand, we are holding you accountable for this, even if you're coming from the left, right? I don't want to create a false equivalency, because there's a lot more dark money that's spent by the right than there is by the left. But this is not something that only Republicans do. So we have to make sure that Democrats are held accountable as well. And just recently, 2 days ago, a dark money Google alert popped up. There were about 12 different Google alerts that day, or part of a day, I think it was. And each one of them was from a different state. And I think that's interesting to watch that spread. I mean, I have personally witnessed the spreading of people talking about this issue. And I think there's more to come there. So yeah, working on a city council by city council, and then a state by state strategy through state legislatures is, I think, gonna be really, really effective. And that part of the reason for that is that at the federal level, things are just so utterly broken. And there's kind of two sides to that. One is that Republican leadership has decided to just weaponize dark money and make sure that we control it and take advantage of that, you know, that political tool that we have. And Mitch McConnell and Republican leadership has been very clear that that's the position that they're taking. There have been riders attached to every budget that's been passed in the last few years, preventing any sort of legislation of 501c4s or how those rules and regulations are set. So that's one side of it. Is like at the federal level, it's just been weaponized. That is not true on a state-to-state level. Most of the states that were on my list of, you know, states that are discussing dark money were red states. So that's one thing, is that, you know, leadership has decided to weaponize it. The other part of that equation is slipping my mind. I don't know what I'm talking about. I've been rambling about this stuff.
I can't imagine all the press you're doing and all of these discussions. But no, I think that makes perfect sense.
This morning.
I know. Oh my goodness. Well, we'll let you go in a second. But absolutely, I think that makes so, you know, a lot of sense. And it's certainly the case that, of course, on the left, whatever that is, you know, also uses independent expenditures as a means to influence elections. Of course, I think that one of the things that comes out in Jane Mayer's book is the profound differences in the infrastructure between the right and the left, essentially boiling down to the right being the sort of strategy and execution being controlled by a very few number of very wealthy families and individuals, whereas on the left there's a very diffuse, much larger coalition or network of issue-based organizations and other sorts of nonprofits and whatever. But it's diffuse. It's not strategic and focused the way that it is on the right.
The other really important thing about that is profit motive, because if you look at the way that dark money is spent by groups on the right, you know, down to changing legislation is going to financially benefit the people who are behind the dark money that is being given, as opposed to, you know, issue-based advocacy where there's no profit motive. In fact, it may be quite the opposite.
Absolutely, especially for issue-based groups that are focused on criminal justice reform or women's rights, LGBTQ rights, all of that. So absolutely. So, but I mean, I think that it is absolutely the case that there is that independent expenditures exist on both the right and the left, and I think that there is enormous opportunity at the state and local level, as you point out, to have citizens have a voice in how those expenditures are, you know, the transparency that we can require of our of the dark money on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, and the public disclosure that we can require in that process. And so I do think that there is a very positive message that can come out of the Montana example. And it's in a way, it's poetic that it came out of a state that more than 100 years ago passed a campaign finance law, which I'm no scholar of history, but that must have been a very early example, if not the earliest example, of a state ballot initiative around campaign finance. So what a poetic arc to come back to this state, this particular state, to see how things are working 100 years later. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and I just remember the other point. I was talking about 2 points why it's good to go back to the states. One is that, you know, at the federal level, dark money has been weaponized. The other is that at the federal level, the enforcement mechanism, which is the FEC, is just completely not functioning. It's one of the things that you see in the trailer for our film, and that you see in some of the clips, is just like you know, the FEC has just been kind of grenaded. So many is not enforcing any campaign finance law, but that can be done on the state level, and is what happened in Montana, where you have when you have the right laws in place, and when somebody's enforcing those, and that can be amplified greatly by voters who are paying attention to it, by a strong watchdog press that is paying attention to this, writing stories on it, and educating the voters, and increasing the, you know, the oxygen of sunlight in this terrarium in which like fair elections can take place. You can really change the culture, and you can do that like state by state in a way that is much more effective than kind of spinning our wheels at a federal level. So I think the approach, the state by state approach you guys are taking is interesting.
That's fantastic. Well, I can't wait to see the film. Comes out on Friday in New York, and then throughout the rest of the country starting next week. Thank you so much, Kim, for sitting for this chat. It's been absolutely fascinating, and thank you for doing this work.
Thank you so much for having me. It's nice to talk to y'all. Good luck.
Have a good one.